Thank you, everyone, for coming back. I just want to introduce the ending of this evening. To end it, in its last hour, we have organized a panel of action to question the current exclusivity of architectural institutions, systems, and discourses, and how they could all be made more accessible. The panel consists of Chris Laing, an architectural designer, activist, consultant, and the founder of Sign Strokes. He is also due to establish Deaf Architecture Front in the near future. He is keen on facilitation between the deaf community and spatial and architectural practices, with a view to encouraging architects to reap the benefits of deaf people's perspectives. Chris will be accompanied by Thandi Loewenson, an architectural designer and researcher who mobilizes design, fiction, and performance. She engages in projects which question the status quo whilst working with communities, policymakers, unions, artists, and architects towards acting on those provocations. Our third panelist, Papa Omotayo, is an architect, designer, writer, and filmmaker. His work strongly focuses on exploring the nature of culture and the context within contemporary Nigeria and the extended African conditions, both globally and locally. He currently lives and works in Lagos and is the founder of a white space creative agency and creative director of MOE Plus Art Architecture. Our final panelist is Jordan Whitewood-Neal, who is with us online today. He is a disabled architectural researcher at the University of Brighton. He explores disability, pedagogy, and the rhetoric of domesticity at the Architectural Association. He is a young trustee of the Architecture Foundation, a teaching development fellow at the London School of Architecture, and a co-founder of Disability Collective, DIS/. The panel will be chaired by Calvin Po and Rhiarna Dhaliwal. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Calvin. I am a 6'3" Chinese male in my late 20s wearing all black, and I'll be one of the co-chairs of the panel this evening.
Hello, my name is Rhiarna. I'm 5'7", wearing a neon green dress, and that was purposely for this event, for this audio description. And I'll also be co-chairing the panel with Calvin.
So yeah, we've decided to frame this segment as a panel of action. And all the guests who've been invited this evening have all been active participants or started initiatives in terms of organizing and kind of grassroots actions to start to overcome some of the barriers and accessibility issues that we have touched on this evening. But perhaps I would like to start with Chris and Jordan, who've kind of started some of initiatives such as the Deaf Architecture Front and also the Disabled Architects Network. And I was wondering if you would like to start us off this evening.
Lovely, thank you, Calvin. My name's Chris Laing. I'm black. I'm wearing a white t-shirt and cream trousers. I've got a beard currently, and I've got one earring. I established Deaf Architectural Front to create a bridge between the deaf community and architecture. There is a continual huge range of issues in which it means that lots of people within the deaf community cannot gain access. At the age of 8, I decided I wanted to become an architect, and there was no role models for me. There was nobody that I could look to, that I could gain confidence from, to make me think, yes, I can become an architect. My journey has had many struggles. And when I was thinking about becoming an architect, first of all, I was having to consider also my first language being BSL and my second language being English. I'm the only deaf person in my family, everyone else is hearing. And my family do have BSL, and they learn BSL, but English is my second language. It wasn't a straightforward decision for me to become an architect because confidence was an issue. So firstly, I decided to study interior architecture. I think the main reason why I made that choice was because there was no role models. I was thinking, how can I be an architect when there's no reference point? So confidence was an issue. And I was very lucky that I met Martin, who is an architect. And I thought, wow, you know, he empowered me to think, yes, this is something I could do. I could become an architect as well. DAF, Deaf Architectural Front, is really important because there are so many issues that are in practice today and in the built environment. There aren't any considerations for the deaf community within practice, and there are so many barriers. And also language plays a big part for that, as well as opportunity, because there is a lack of accessible spaces. So for instance, when we're thinking about internships or work experience, we don't for a second as a hearing person think about going and just experiencing it. But as a deaf person, how do you gain access? Where are the interpreters? Where is the budget for the interpreters? There is none. So there is something called access to work, which the government funds in workplaces for interpreters. But there is nothing for internships. So young people don't have an access route to gaining experiences like their hearing impairs do. And when we think about budgets and opportunities, they're all interlinked. So Deaf Architectural Front is in part also campaigning to make a change. So there is funding for architectural students. Recently at Howth Tompkins, there were 2 students that worked with me alongside with me, but I had to use my budget for interpreters so that they could have that experience, so that they could experience what it's like to be in a workplace and what it means to be an architect. Same when we think about university settings, there is a lack of deaf awareness and the needs for deaf people. When I arrived at a university in the last few years, there was a lack of understanding about what was needed, and it was a constant fight. You know, I think that lots of students, when they're thinking about their architectural journey, could quite easily give up because the barriers are just too many. And this shouldn't be happening. So Deaf Architectural Front is creating resources. It's a place of encouragement. It's a progressive, collaborative project to move things in the right direction. It also will mean that we can work collaboratively. We can share information. We can share experiences about how we access and how we make change happen, so that the younger people coming forward don't have to experience what we have. When we think about a public consultation, for instance, if you think about how the deaf community would gain access to that if there's no BSL interpreter there, if all the information is in English, how will someone engage with the decisions that are being made? How will someone feel comfortable about taking part in this decision when information isn't being translated? There needs to be access there and comfortability for people to be able to engage in their communities. Where is the budget for interpreters so the deaf community can be involved? They can't be involved if there's no budget. For instance, also online, when we think about the content online, everything is very English heavy, very text heavy. So where is the BSL content? Where are the BSL videos? So when I talk about Deaf Architectural Front, there is a plethora of issues that I'm trying to address. And the hope is that future generations will be able to become architects. You know, there's very few architects that are qualified that are deaf, maybe 4 or 5 nationwide. And it's only because of the barriers that we have this very small number of deaf architects in practice in the UK today. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Perhaps I'd like to bring in Thandi's perspective on this, because you as an educator perhaps also have seen similar challenges in terms of providing accessibility in an educational setting. But I think in terms of your work, you've also addressed accessibility issues more broadly in terms of education, how, for example, we've kind of formed this service provider customer relationship to education. Also the idea of, you know, for example, the canon, what you're teaching might be of a of a very kind of narrow kind of worldview. Would you like to kind of touch on some of those issues?
Thank you. That was such a nice segue. I didn't know where you were going to go with that. Hi, I used to say on the apps that I was 5'7". I think I'm more like 5'3", if I'm honest. And shout out everyone for going Love Island tonight. Respect. Yeah, I think the work that you are doing, Chris, is amazing, really, really exciting. And also Jordan, excited to hear from you as well soon. I think what's really interesting about what you raised, Chris, is that part of the struggles in terms of, I don't want to talk about accessibility, I think Just Voice summed that up really well just now, but part of the struggles within these institutions is around funding and the economics of how institutions are set up. So it's really structurally engaged, the way that these barriers form and the language that arises around those barriers. And so I think it's really interesting what you're doing, which is pointing to those kind of structural dynamics and the economics of them. In my own work, this has been through a collective that I founded with 4 other people at the Bartlett, which was called Breakline, and we were thinking very much around how it was financial strictures that meant that particular people were studying and teaching there. And those financial strictures were in terms of the fees, but also in terms of pay. So who can actually afford to teach there? And I both studied and taught there and found it almost impossible. Yeah, maybe let's not go into detail there. I don't teach there anymore. Maybe that should tell you what you need to know. And so these financial strictures also determine which communities are involved in these institutions, both in terms of studying and teaching, as Chris has already mentioned, but also the cultures that are within these institutions too. And so actually Adrian Lahoud, the Dean of the RCA, where I currently work, has been making some really interesting points recently where he talks about kind of cultural knowledge and the language of particular forms of cultural knowledge that are so embedded within architectural education. So how we speak about architecture, but also, you know, the frames of references that we have, what we'll have seen, what we'll have been exposed to, and how that's constantly being reproduced. And part of the survival of people that aren't typically included in these institutions is about learning those cultural references and learning that language as part of the study, rather than, which could be a much more exciting project, thinking about what happens to disciplines, what happens to practice when we broaden our ideas of what we think with, how we speak. And yeah, I think that's a project that I'm much more interested in. So some work that I've been doing with Huda Tayab and Susie Hall, it's been a project called Race, Space and Architecture, which thinks about exactly that. So if we are to move beyond what we call the canon, but what we could also call a white patriarchal structure of knowledge and way of teaching it, what happens to architecture? What happens to how we conceive of our world and practice within it? But one thing that's really key in that project and in all of the projects that I've spoken about has been an understanding that race and space are co-constituted, but also constituted in connection with economic systems. So we can't see them in isolation. Any project that's about, well, let me put it this way. Beyonce's Black capitalism is not saving anyone. Don't be fooled. Neither is like whatever Sajid Javid or Rishi Sunak are going to promise us all. Don't be fooled by that either. We need to really think very seriously about
what underlies those economic systems and what kind of racial and social formations are held within them, basically. I think I've probably talked enough.
I think that's a really interesting segue for Papa's work, looking at the kind of context that you operate within, moving on from the kind of financial structures that operate or dictate educational institutions in Europe, and then looking at the notion of kind of financial and resource allocation and extraction that's going on, particularly in Western Africa, and then kind of spaces that, Papa, you're operating in regards to how language, how people who are outside of design and architectural discourse, how they are able to engage within these spaces when they may not necessarily have access to the skill set which allows them to kind of communicate in that kind of way.
As we say, which is good evening and thank you for this generous gathering. I guess on the forms here, I take Black African, but I'm actually from the Yoruba ethnic tribe, which is in southwestern Nigeria. It's very, very specific. I'm wearing white trainers, blue rolled up trousers, and an adire dye, which is a kind of batik red short sleeve shirt. This is really great conversation. Throughout the evening, spoken word is beautiful. And Joss's conversation was great. Sorry, where I'm from, we have to do this. Normally we say, ladies and gentlemen, politicians. And that takes up about 30 minutes. But I'll just say all protocols observed. I think like what has really been critical for me, and I was educated in the United Kingdom, and I think one of the things I found really, really problematic was the inability for the institutions to engage in my sort of context, or whether that was like my upbringing or my thinking about materials, or even thinking about space, the language of what space is, in like my traditions, there's not a real objectification of art or architecture. Space is a very, very sort of spiritual intersected thing that is part of everything. And there is a real sense of decentralization. And if an example is like Nigeria has about 245 languages, but as a former English colony, what we are sort of left with is this approach, which is, I think I call it like an extraction to the center. And I think I see that a lot when I think about sort of how I used to think about architecture from my Western education, and how the engagement of architecture, which is this constant extraction to the center, when in reality, and I think what we've been talking about today a lot is about decentralization and how that empowers multiple narratives and multiple discourses, where you're bringing people together to really kind of interrogate the why, the how. When you move away from this need to sort of centralize terminology, or to state things as movements, or, like it's so interesting, in our work when we're working in projects that engage with local communities, and how that is written about in Western media, and how it's engaged with in the local context. So, and I think these are really interesting conversations about the idea of power and how that segments itself, not just into language, but into rights of access. And then that now kind of creates value systems. So in the universities or with the students that I work with, it's really hard for someone to have a laptop, let alone like access to like AutoCAD or Photoshop. But there is even harder to convince them to come and participate in a participatory build project that is using like earth construction, because there is an extraction to the center where there's this generalized notion of what architecture should sort of look, feel like, 3D renderings, and you're engaging with clients and they're speaking to you with this terminology that is completely, I don't want to say irrelevant, because like you've mentioned, so much of architecture, not just in the discourse, but in the building is about capital, and that is wherever you are, access to capital gives you power. But I think what I think is really important, and why I feel you get the most satisfaction, is when you bring people together to sort of remove things that don't exist in their reality, So what I mean by that is, in the space where I come from, something like data is very expensive, right? Computers are very expensive. So many things. But then there's a willingness to kind of remove those things from your context and say, look, what happens if we don't have those things? What are the opportunities that we can offer to this wider discussion and this wider discourse?
Perhaps I'd like to pick up on that point about centralization and also a high kind of barrier of access, because I think, in the architecture is by itself a legally protected profession. You have the ARB, the RBA deciding to represent the kind of whole industry. And I'd like to bring Jordan in perhaps on this point as well. Is like architecture inherently elitist? And it's that why that it's always coming up with barriers to access. And even the people who write about architecture critics, they come from a very small kind of privileged group. Would you like to?
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly.
Cool. First of all, I'm a white man, brown hair, glasses, and unfortunately not as tall as this big screen suggests. Wish I was. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So you speak to two things there in terms of elitism, in terms of access to education, and also sort of access to criticism, which I think are two, imperative things. And maybe it's a good opportunity to sort of speak to, in the same way that Chris was, what we're trying to achieve with two groups that we're trying to establish at the moment. One is a Disabled Architects Network, or Disability in Architecture Network, which really it wants to address the dwindling or limited numbers of disabled people in architecture education. And you can see this even in such things as the ARB report recently in terms of modernizing education, which made zero reference to disability at all in their report. But there's also the issue of support within institutions, which is a major limitation. And one example I can give to this, which is more a personal one, was that when I went for an interview for a bachelor's course many, many years ago, the head of the school, I won't say who, but the head of the school told me that I might not be able to do first year because of my hands. Now, when you're 17, 18, and your dream profession is sitting in front of you and someone's telling you you probably can't do it, it's hard to sort of fight through that. So we're hoping this network is both a way of supporting students to get into school and educate architecture education, but also to help them fight the challenges which we inevitably find in the education itself, which is inequitable pedagogies, inflexible ways of creating architecture, talking about architecture. And I guess that leads on to your second question about criticism. And that is something we're trying to address in a collective, which you mentioned, which is called DIS, drawing from that prefix of sort of opposition. And we started off with that exact sort of simple but not easy question, which is, what does it mean to be in opposition to something, culturally, spatially, critically? So art and architectural discourse and kind of any disciplinary or public critique of space is often imbued with language and rhetoric that does not include disabled voices, or cannot include them. So those who are most often opposed by space rather than being opposed to it. So we very rarely have a chance to be critical about the spaces that we inhabit or the spaces that we can't inhabit. So there's a real issue of distance there, which we want to address. So criticism is an interesting thing, and like you said, it's often been spoken of, practiced by a traditional type of person. But what we want to explore is that, the fact that the disabled voice in the lineage of architectural criticism is neglected, yet disabled people who often encounter buildings, they do this in the most critical and challenging of ways. And are undoubtedly some of the most valuable potential voices in understanding the issues and successes at the heart of built space. So education has almost a responsibility, really, and so the institutions, to widen access to their schools, widen access to their pedagogies, and, as Chris and I are both trying to do, bring more people into the profession, into the discourse, and allow us to start critiquing too.
In regards to kind of bringing people into the profession, I think it's also interesting how we can see architects and designers engaging with other people outside of our profession as well and learning from them. So in regards to Papa, I know that you work a lot with other kind of cultural and artistic professions, but then I also feel that maybe Jordan and also Chris could also speak on this too, about how in the term, whether it's through language, how we can kind of open through those barriers to engage other people and to also develop skill sets and kind of a toolkit for people to also engage with the profession who don't sit within it anyway. If you can maybe talk about on that.
Oh, okay. So I mean, we've been working on a few years on a really interesting project actually with British Nigerian artist called Yinka Shonibari. And it's, I mean, it was the first time I've had a client that is disabled. And that was really, really interesting. And also as an artist, and the project also worked within an isolated community that had zero, almost no, I guess, what you would term high skill building skills. And also the project worked with farmers because the idea was to create an ecosystem that sort of allowed all of these things to sort of live and work together. And then we worked with somebody that was thinking about material science. And then obviously there was the working with a political segment, because what we were also trying to do is to see how, create this space that is really about artistic engagement. But then how do you use that to empower local communities in other ways? So you're doing a building, so you make sure that the community learn the skills that you're going to have in the building. And then you're going to engage in these programs that talk about culture and art. So you're going to work with the local governments to kind of figure out how there can be a real understanding or relationship with these things. And I think for us, that's a really interesting and engaging way that we like to work. I think in all our projects, we really try and figure out how many voices can be part of the process. at the very onset, and I think that also enriches the end product, which isn't always architecture. Sometimes, you know, it becomes a street festival or something else.
When we're thinking about resources and how people access those, Deaf Architectural Front and Sign Strokes, that was established in 2020 with Adam Christopher sitting in the front row there. We wanted to think about how BSL and lexical terms used in practice would be approved as a language in its own right and then used in the wider sphere of architecture. Many interpreters, for instance, and many deaf architects didn't have a lexicon until Sign Strokes. There was no established terms. We want interpreters that work within the profession to have the language that we have in practice. So when I use a different word, or they might say light through a roof, if they don't have the term for atrium, if they don't have that lexical dictionary to go to, or whether that's in English or in BSL. So we created Sign Strokes to make sure that the language was there that can be used in practice. And that someone might know what that doesn't mean in a context of a public consultation. And we can then create a sign so it means that someone knows what that means. So I'm using the sign for posh here, and then I'm using the sign for taking over. And so I'm combining those two signs into one, which means gentrification. But also a lot of the signs I'm giving you now are very visual. I'm using a sign here for cantilever, and they're referencing how a building is positioned. We created over 100 signs. And it was a beautiful process because we both were able to work with a linguist who was able to show us the process in which we created a language. When we think about signing space, hand movement, we also were able to create a workshop in which the deaf community could contribute. Many of the people at the workshop had no background in architecture, and some did, but it meant that we were able to really engage with them in a way about what the words mean, what does the jargon mean, and then agree collectively about what signs were going to be used and approved. And it was a beautiful process because of that collaboration and because of the mix of people. It benefits everybody to have established lexicon, and it also benefits my hearing colleagues when I'm in the workplace as well. I mean, hopefully in the future, it's possible that it could be made into a corpus of some sort. But I've had so much feedback from different people in regards to schools and other educational establishments about how useful it is to have a language to use in a context of education or in the workplace. The hope is in the future to create more resources in terms of an online resource with more videos that people can use to learn these specific signs. And also we're thinking about disabled architectural network, because when we think about the benefits for everybody and my master's and how I struggled, I want to be able to make sure that others don't have that same struggle. I did my part 1 at Kingston and I knew exactly what I needed, and they provided that for me. I didn't have to explain what I needed, they just knew what to do. And I had this opportunity to experience a different university, and I had this expectation that they would know what I needed. And when I started, I realized they had no idea. And I was having to explain myself about my needs. And emotionally, I was exhausted by it and stressed by it. I just wanted to focus on practice and learning and my master's, and I couldn't. And, you know, Dan really supported me in that respect, because it made me think about all the different things that I needed to focus on and try and park the stress. but it was a constant challenge at my master's. And I was very lucky that there were a number of people within the organization that supported me specifically. But when I'm talking about resources, I'm also thinking about how educational establishments are not providing what they need to. So I'm the missing gap. You know, where are the role models? Where are the people that are able in institutions to provide these resources? We're having to create them ourselves. You know, and we have to advocate and we have to be our own supporters and allies. You know, I really wish that there were people like us now back in the day, because it would have been such a more easier process for me. But, you know, when we think about resources and access, it benefits everybody. It's never just one community. Everybody always benefits.
Perhaps on that note, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But I know you probably need some time to think of a question. So maybe I can start with asking Thandi, you're involved, apart from your own initiatives, along with other groups as well. Perhaps if the audience members want to get involved in kind of taking action, as this is a panel of action, what kind of groups can they kind of keep an eye out for?
Yeah, well.
Apart from the very great initiatives mentioned by Chris, Papa, and Jordan, of
course.
course.
In addition, yeah, I think some of the most interesting groups that I've been involved in have been unions. And so I encourage everybody to, if you're not already a member, to join UVW SAW, who are the section of architectural workers. And I think or if you're teaching, to join UCU, if you're a student, to join the NUS. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. UVW SAW, like cutting. Yeah. No worries. And I think what's interesting I was thinking about this as everybody's been speaking, and I think what's interesting about the architecture that we've inherited is that it's a highly professionalized course and practice that sets up this idea of the architect as the genius that comes in and delivers a solution. And unions don't operate in that way at all. They have a completely different worldview and understanding of how power can be organized, and that is collectively, but also how we can collectively work together, imagine futures and enact futures. And so working with unions has actually given me a completely radically different worldview and language with which to express that worldview to then bring back to architecture. And so those are just some of the groups. Of course, new architecture writers, I've heard, are pretty good.
I think before we go into the questions, Jordan, for closing remarks, also if you could build upon maybe some of the kind of grassroots organizations that you're a part of, building upon what Chris and what Thandi said.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, I think one of the obvious ones is Future Architects Front, which are doing an amazing job at the moment of really pushing for workers' rights. And I think that why that speaks so much to me is because I view workers' rights equally as much as, well, on equal standing with disability rights. The two come hand in hand, especially where both in education and practice, the labor we are expected to enact in those spaces is amplified with disabilities. And when you add that to processes of complaints, so I'm thinking of sort of Sarah Ahmed's book, you're compounding that labor even more. So groups like that, which are really confronting both practices of overworking and oppression in that way, are vital. And I think we need more of it, really. So everyone get on board.
Thank you. Do we have any, well, we can do a round of applause. I think we have around 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes for questions, either in the audience or if there's also anyone on Zoom who have any, I can hand the mic to. If there's any questions in the audience. Questions, anyone? Don't be shy.
I have a question. Thank you so much to all the panelists for speaking. It's really insightful to find out more about all your practice and the ways that you're sort of, in my opinion, decolonizing the curriculum and really carving out space. I wanted to ask, well, I'll just put this question generally to all of you. Being an architect is already hard enough. So how do you sort of navigate within your personal and professional life, working in architecture, but then also having this sort of activist role where you're really trying to carve out space? And what are the certain boundaries that you've put in place as you operate?
Yeah, it's really, that term architect as well. Yeah, because it's so loaded, man. And depending on where you're from as well, right? So like, you know, I think for me, I'm always thinking about myself as a facilitator. And I think the boundaries thing is a very, very personal thing. I think for me, I'm not sure I'm a fan of boundaries for the reason where I feel that, you know, I constantly need to challenge the conditions that I exist in. And I'm not trying to get philosophical here. I'm just like, look, I'm a product of a colonized country and an education system that had no interest in the context of like my heritage. I can trace every single family member in my entire history to the same village I currently live now. Like I'm talking for thousands of years. That was not part of my understanding or my education, you know? So I think the boundaries are yet to be formed. And I think for me, it's really about the investigation and the engagement of new spaces that challenge your preconceived notions of what it means to be an architect, what it means to be, you know, an intellectual or whatever. So yeah, that's it for me. But I think one thing that is really, really good and very, very important is things like this, like constantly putting yourself in spaces like this. Because for me, this is also quite new and extremely, so yeah, it's a privilege to be here. So thank you.
So just to clarify, when you're talking about the boundary and the line between professional and personal, I'm always like trying to make sure that I have my self-care as a priority. I have to make sure that there are limits and that I know what those limits are, because it can be a lonely place to be always the person fighting. And, you know, I also need to know I'm in safe spaces, and the people that I surround myself with are in safe spaces, and that I can make sure that people are engaging with me to improve as a team. And that sometimes can be a challenge. I then have to sometimes park one thing I'm doing to be able to focus on another. So for example, if there is an opportunity for me to speak or teach. I have to consult and engage with my workplace to make sure that I'm able to do that at the same time as managing my projects and my deadlines at work. But I need to make these connections outside of my workplace as an architect. And I need to also make the work experience opportunities happen that I did for my deaf students a few weeks ago. So it's a constant push and pull of managing the time, expectations, and the challenges. You know, I wasn't born someone who was an activist, but it's something that I'm passionate about, and I'm seeing why it's so important that I am having this role. Not everybody has the same passion. Not everybody wants to become an architect. So we have to think about that, but it's possible that people want to become creative in some way. And we also have to think about the boundaries and self-care and our limits. I think that's it for me.
Jordan?
Yeah, I find this idea of boundaries really interesting, and it's something I explore, or am exploring at the moment in the research. And how can I explain it? So, I mean, Nabil and Belinda spoke earlier about this idea of that acting in your way is itself a form of resistance. In my research, I explore, the rhetoric of home, of domesticity as a space of care, comfort, safety. But historically, disabled people have, essentially been isolated in the home. So the rhetoric of it is very different for us. So our intimacies, our functions as a body, as a person, are contained within that. So that language of the home becomes very different in terms of, depending on how you frame it. So that boundary between what you do as an activist and the work you practice can sometimes become very grey. And what I'm arguing for is that why can we not bring those disabled domesticities that happen and make them visible? They become part of public space. They are removed or taken out of the private realm into the public realm, into institutions, and made visible so that they're no longer this sort of unknown thing that we choose to ignore and choose to oppress into a certain space. So that's how I sort of think of this idea of boundaries between the self and the work that we do. And I think it's a really, good question to ask all of us, because what we're trying to do is very much entangled with our own embodiments and who we are and what we have to face on a daily basis. So yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, also on an embodied line, you're going to come up against a lot. And one thing that has really got me through is finding someone to catch eyes with, and knowing that they knowing that they understand, that they also see this as being bullshit when things happen. And then slowly those people become more and more, and having people that are your safe space, that constitute your community, goes a huge way, I think. And those communities might also be different. So they might be Deaf Architects Network, DIS, but I think they can also start to overlap and intersect too, which I think is super exciting, like a panel like this. So yeah, I'm glad I got people to catch eyes with. I've been catching eyes with them.
I mean, it's amazing conversation, but I think we're going to try and wrap up now with the closing remarks. But yeah, I mean, another round of applause, maybe. Thank you to our panelists.
Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Aquilina. I'm wearing trousers, but should be wearing shorts. I'm wearing black, but should be wearing color. Just 2 minutes as one of the co-directors of New Architecture Writers with Tom Wilkinson. I just want to say a big thank you and how proud we are of the members, all 9 of them who have been on stage and delivered this tonight. So a round of applause to them. Thank you to Amy and to Bernadette, our 2 BSL interpreters. A lesson for ourselves is that you should give them briefing way in advance, and they only received that today, so apologies from us. We're still, this is very much a prototype event, but they've done extraordinarily well. The LSA, the London School of Architecture, gave us the kit over here. They also lended us David today, so thank you. The Architecture Foundation continue to be our chief backers. Matea is in the room. Also Ellis is watching from Bordeaux. Thank you to you both. But there was something interesting that you said earlier, Papa, which was about this extraction to the center, because we had an event in 2019 called Drawing the Edge to the Center. So we've had this idea about, I suppose, edges and boundaries and their blurred lines for some time. Sometimes break the line, literally. But the reason I wanted to say this is really to reserve a big thank you to Rosie Gibbs-Stevenson, who has curated and pulled this together and held all the strings, and has been integral to New Architecture Writers for the last 2 or 3 years, but is sort of bowing out with this gathering. So thank you, Rosie. For those online, you should have a pamphlet, and for those in the room, you should have one on your seats. And in the middle section, there's a set of questions that I think hopefully you can take away and keep in your mind. There are 5 questions, which is, who is heard and how do we listen? Who gets to write about architecture and who reads this writing? Who has access to the technical, institutional, and conceptual tools that are necessary to produce and consume it? Who pays for the labor of writing? And what can we do to change these structures? So hopefully over the course of tonight, we've began to tease out some of those answers, but we encourage you, the audience, to continue to do so yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And just a few really last, actually final closing remarks from me. Promise. Some really special thanks to the wonderful people and organizations, both visible in this room and behind the scenes, who helped to make this evening happen. So first, the Graham Foundation for the grant, the Zaha Hadid Foundation for the space. And just to say a little bit more about the Zaha Hadid Foundation, they launched this year as a charitable organization, and their kind of aim is to preserve the kind of extraordinary legacy of Zaha Hadid's work in this building, and it's going to be open publicly. But also they're trying to sort of more broadly advance research, learning, and the enjoyment of modern art and architecture and design. I want to say thank you to the working group who did a lot of work behind the scenes. A lot of time and effort went into this event. So that's Jessica Ryan Degwa, that's also Jordan Whitewood-Neal, Christopher Laing, Thomas Aquilina, and of course, Rosie Gibbs-Stevenson, and then also our chair, who is Chloe Spivey-Lowe. I'd like to also separately just thank Thomas and Tom as our tutors for their support and guidance over the last 6 months. It's been really fun. And
Finally, thank you to all of you for coming. It's been a pleasure to be able to share this work with you, to have you in the space and to learn together. Really fantastic guests and collaborators that we've had today. So it's been a privilege to have this space with you all. Have a really good evening. Thank you.